When we think about the great revolutions in the Americas, the story often sounds pretty familiar, right? You've got brave patriots, they're inspired by liberty, and they throw off the chains of some king far, far away. And look, that's definitely part of the story for Latin America, but it is nowhere near the whole story. The real history is so much deeper, and honestly, a lot more interesting. So that brings us to the big question we're going to tackle today. Were the Latin American independence movements just an echo, a copy of what happened in the United States and France? Or were they singing a totally new song, one that came from their own unique and often brutal history? All right, so the story does kick off with this incredible set of ideas that made their way across the Atlantic. I mean, you can't overstate this. The success of the American and French revolutions was a seismic shock to the old world order. It was like a blueprint for freedom, a playbook that showed what was actually possible. And this was the intellectual ammo the revolutionaries were using. They were reading about these incredible concepts, things like natural rights, the idea that you are born with certain freedoms that no one can take away, or a government that has to serve the common good. They saw the absolute power in demanding self-determination, and that really radical idea of consents of the governed, the notion that a government is only legit if the people actually agree to it. These weren't just dusty old theories, they were explosive. They were a direct challenge to the entire colonial system. But here's the thing, and this is the absolute key. A spark is totally useless if there's nothing to catch fire. All these powerful ideas about liberty and rights, they landed on ground that was already primed for a massive explosion. Ideals on their own just don't start wars. You need generations of dry tinder, of real, deep-seated grievances waiting for that match to be struck. And that right there brings us to the real heart of our explainer, the local reality. To get what was really going on, we have to look past those imported ideas and stare directly at the brutal day-to-day conditions that people were living under in Latin America. And this local reality, well, it was built on three specific, centuries-old systems of oppression. And these weren't just bad policies. No. They were the very foundation of the whole colonial world. The economy, the society, this was the real fuel for the fire. So let's break them down. First up, you have the encomienda. Now, on paper, this was a grant from the Spanish crown, supposedly to protect indigenous people. But in reality, it gave Spanish lords total, crushing control over entire communities. It was never about owning the land. It was about owning the people on the land. It created this whole society built from the ground up on forced, unpaid labor. Next, there was the mita. And this is a really cynical one. The Spanish basically took an old Incan system of community service and twisted it into something absolutely monstrous. Entire villages were forced to send a chunk of their male population to go work in just unbelievably awful conditions, especially in the silver mines, like the infamous ones at Potosi. For so many, being sent to the Mita was basically a death sentence. And finally, chattel slavery. This was the most absolute, the most total form of dehumanization. We're talking about millions of Africans and their descendants who were legally considered property, chattel, just like a piece of furniture or livestock. They could be bought, sold, tortured, and inherited. This brutal economic engine powered the whole colonial project and created a simmering, constant state of resistance. So when you put it all together, you can really see the two sides of the coin. Over here, you've got the shared inspiration, that philosophical spark from Europe and North America. And over here, you have the unique causes, the actual fuel, the daily reality of suffering under the encomienda, the mita, and chattel slavery. The revolution is what happens when that spark finally hits that fuel. This is why, when leaders like Simón Bolívar started talking about freedom, they weren't just repeating words they'd read in a book. Their call for liberty hit so hard because it was a direct answer to these specific systems of exploitation. They were forging a completely new path, one born out of their own reality. And that brings us right back to our original question. Was it just an echo? No way. It was a brand new song of freedom. And its lyrics weren't written in some Parisian salon or in a hall in Philadelphia. They were written in the silver mines of Potosi, on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and in villages crushed under the thumb of the encomienda. The melody might sound familiar, but the words, the pain, the passion, that was all their own. And look, understanding this isn't just some academic exercise. It completely changes how we see things today. It makes us ask a really important question. If a nation is born not just out of high-minded ideals, but as a direct rejection of centuries of exploitation, how does that shape its identity, its politics, and its struggles for generations to come? Knowing the real reasons for the revolution, well, that changes its entire legacy.